Hi, and welcome to part one of Deep Rest, Hasidic Insights into the Sabbatical Year. Let's begin by reviewing what the Sabbatical Year is, known in Hebrew as Shemitah. In the land of Israel, there was a 7-year agricultural cycle. During the first 6 years of that cycle, there were various tithes that were given, tithes to the priests, to the Levite, depending on the year, either to a poor person or to be brought to Jerusalem to support the economy of Jerusalem. In the 7th year, there was no planting, no harvesting, and obviously no tithes, therefore. In the 7th year, the land would lie fallow. I'm going to read to you from the Art Scroll Chumash. I'm going to read to you the selection from this week's Torah portion about the sabbatical year. And I'm going to read the first line only in Hebrew, and then we're going to read it in English. It'll be up on your screen, so you'll be able to follow along. Vayidaber Adonai el Moshe b'Har Sinai Lemor. God spoke to Moshe at Mount Sinai, saying. Okay, now we're in the English translation. Hashem spoke to Moses on Mount Sinai, saying, "Speak to the children of Israel and say to them, when you come into the land that I give you, the land shall observe a Sabbath rest for Hashem, Shabbat. For 6 years you may sow your field, and for 6 years you may prune your vineyard, and you may gather its crop. But the 7th year shall be a complete rest for the land, a Shabbos for Hashem. Your field you shall not sow, and your vineyard you shall not prune. The aftergrowth of your harvest you shall not reap, and the grapes you had set aside for yourself you shall not pick. It shall be a year of rest for the land. The Shabbos produce of the land shall be yours to eat, for you, for your slave, and for your maidservant, and for your laborer, and for your resident who dwells with you, and for your animal, and for the beast that is in your land, shall all its crop be to eat." This is the Torah selection drawn from the book of Leviticus, chapter 25. This is the Torah selection about the Shemitah year. So every 7th year the land would lie fallow. Now, the rationalist explanation for this is very straightforward. All right, the most rational seeming explanation for this is, we all know that rotating crops is good, that fields should be left fallow, they need to renew themselves, and therefore this is just the Torah instituting a law to reflect the practice of letting the lands fly fallow so that they can be renewed. The problem with this approach is at least twofold. First of all, if you're going to have a set of crop rotation, the intelligent thing to do is to rotate part of your crops every 7 years, not to have 1 year where everything rests, and you therefore have a situation where you would naturally be concerned, although we'll discuss this tomorrow, you would naturally be concerned, what am I going to eat, right? I can't harvest, I can't plant, I can't harvest, right? What you would do if all you were concerned with was the renewal of the land is you would rotate a segment, a piece every 7 years, let's just take that number. Every 7 years, you'd leave another 7th of your field fallow in order to renew the land. Renewing all the land at once and having nobody work the land at all, this is not the most rational, most constructive way to go about renewing the land on which you work. The second problem is that when we look through the ancient Near East, the ancient Near East had the same farming practices as the Jews did in the land of Israel. Farming at the time was technologically what farming at the time was. We do not see anywhere in the ancient Near East where they had this concept of an enforced letting the land rest. Like, this is not like somehow or other this was the agricultural science of the day, because if it was the agricultural science of the day, we would see it in other nations around the land of Israel. Yet despite all the information we have about them and their lifestyles, and all the archaeological evidence that we have no evidence that anybody else was letting their land lie fallow en masse. So the fact that, again, the rationalist or apologetic approach, which says that this was just smart farming to let the land lie fallow, fails on at least 2 points. One, you'd rotate what you let lie fallow. You wouldn't let everything lie fallow in the same year, number one. And number two, it's strange to think that the Jews were aware of this agricultural practice, but nobody around them seemed to know that this was best agricultural practice. we are going to look at several different explanations for the purpose of the Shemitah year, none of which revolve around farming per se. Farming, the benefit might be present, it's a derivative benefit of doing this, but that's not what it's about. It's not about letting the land lie fallow. So we're going to take a look on each of the 3 days. We're going to take a look at a different explanation. And the one we're going to deal with today grapples with a somewhat famous question, which Rashi asks as well. And it brings us back to an oddity in the first verses. Let's take a look at those verses, the very first verse again. Hashem spoke to Moses on Mount Sinai saying, right? God spoke to Moses on Mount Sinai and he gave these commandments. What's strange about this is that we don't see by any other of the commandments that God gave to Moses, it doesn't specify they were given at Mount Sinai, even though it's clear that everything else in the book of Leviticus was also given at Mount Sinai. So why is it that this is being singled out? Ma inyan Shemitah etzel Har Sinai. What is the connection between Shemitah and Mount Sinai? Why is it that those two are linked? So, the explanation which is given by Rashi, the classic explanation which is given by Rashi is that just as, it's just a way of learning to everything else in the Torah, right? It says here that all the details were given of this mitzvah, of the mitzvah of Shemitah. We have here all the details of the mitzvah of Shemitah, just like all the details of mitzvos of Shemitah were given at Mount Sinai. So too, any time a mitzvah was given at Mount Sinai, whether you see a lot of detail or not, there were many more details that were given with it. It was a much more robust presentation than we have necessarily in the Torah, and that's where the oral Torah comes in. Okay? That is the basic explanation of Rashi. We're going to take a look instead at a Hasidic explanation now, and I'm going to read it to you. I'm going to read it to you in the English, and then I'm going to read it to you in the Hebrew and retranslate just to sort of accentuate the reading. The reason for the association of the sabbatical year to Mount Sinai is Mount Sinai is the place where the Jewish people reach their highest level and perceive things that would be otherwise impossible to perceive. And the point of the sabbatical year is faith in God that, as the psalmist says, to God is the earth and all therein. There is a hint here that in order to achieve the levels achieved at Mount Sinai, we should begin with the commandment of the sabbatical year, as that deepens our faith, and only with a deeper faith can we hope to achieve the levels achieved at Mount Sinai. Now, I'm going to read it to you inside in the Hebrew again and retranslate it, because this way I can sort of elaborate a little bit as I read it as well. Okay. The matter of the juxtaposition of Shemitah to Mount Sinai, the reason why they're mentioned together here, is because Mount Sinai is the place where the Jews reached their highest level when they received the Torah, right? There's a midrash which says, Paskazu Masam, they became, at least for that moment, they became immortal, death left them, it only returned after the sin of the golden calf. They had reached the highest levels. They had reached the highest levels which one could possibly reach. Now, the matter of Shemitah is a matter of faith. You have to have faith in order to do Shemitah, to let your land lie fallow in the 7th year and say, I'm not going to plant, I'm not going to harvest, I'm not going to bring it in and put it in my silos, I'm not going to go to market. Basically, one would have to worry, as, by the way, it says later on in the Parsha, one might worry, well, what am I going to eat? So in order to fulfill the mitzvah of Shemitah, if you will, it's rooted in emunah, it's rooted in faith. So there's a hint in this that in order to achieve the level of Sinai, one must start with the mitzvah of Shemitah of the 7th year, the sabbatical year, because that is what causes faith to become more deeply rooted. Once you've lived the faith of putting your faith in God, then the 7th year there'll be enough to eat. I don't have to worry, even though I'm not going to plant and I'm not going to harvest, there'll be enough to eat. Once you've put your faith in God in a practical manner, you've put your faith in God, you're on your way. You've done the essential first step towards reaching the level of Sinai. The mitzvah of Shemitah inculcates within us a faith that is at the root of reaching the high levels of Mount Sinai. This is the explanation which is given here. It's given in the name of the Sabbatical of Slonim, the original rabbi of the Slonim dynasty. That's the explanation that's given here. So again, let's examine. We have an unusual mention of Mount Sinai as being the location where this communication went on. Even though God and Moses communicated at Mount Sinai many things, it's specifically mentioned by this. Why? Because the Jewish people were always supposed to be striving to reattain the levels that we had at Mount Sinai. In order to reattain the levels we had at Mount Sinai, we have to start with faith, and the mitzvah which most directly shows us what our faith is, the one that tests our faith most directly in terms of our material well-being, is the mitzvah of the sabbatical year. The Shemitah year, you let the land lie fallow, there's no harvesting, there's no income. What am I going to eat? I'm relying on God, and God says God will provide. If I'm relying on that, and I understand that God will provide, and that at the end of the day, if I follow what it is that God tells me, I'm going to be okay. If I have that faith becomes the basis of moving up the mountain, if you will. You're on your way up the mountain to Mount Sinai to achieve the highest levels. According to this explanation, the purpose of letting the land lie fallow every 7 years has nothing to do with agriculture, but rather has to do with faith. It's a mitzvah which tests our faith in a way which most mitzvahs don't. It's one where we are clearly depriving ourselves of income. We're clearly relying heavily on God to fill that gap. If we have that faith, we're on our way. This is the explanation of the Sabbatical of Slonim, and the lesson for us is a profound one as well. The basis of advancing as a Jew in the world is faith. We have to believe that God is guiding what's going on around us. Humans mess it up all the time, and God has a lot of cleaning up to do, and maybe He can't clean up everything, but the bottom line is that we have faith in God, that God is going to provide, because it's God's world and God runs the world. When we start with the position that it's God's world, God runs the world, I don't run the world, and therefore I have to listen to God, even if it's against my economic interests, once I have that faith developed, I can move forward. We live in a time where we need a lot of faith. We need a lot of faith. There's a lot going on around us right now. A lot of people are having their income reduced or eliminated. People are struggling. It's going to be a very difficult year for all of us. And we have to have faith in God, that God is going to bring us out on the other side as a better community and as a better nation, as a better congregation. We have faith that will come out on the other side as well. That faith will allow us to advance, to ascend, and it's that faith, rooted in that faith, that we're going to be able to build a better future for ourselves. And so let's close our first session today with a prayer, if you will, that we should see after this time where our fields, our factories, our stores are closed, are lying fallow. We should be able to see that God will provide somehow, and that somehow or other we're going to see on the other side of this that we have moved further up the mountain, that we have become more spiritual, that we have become better people because of this experience. For having survived this experience, we have thrived. And in doing so, we will mimic the mitzvah of Shemitah, ascending up Mount Sinai, rooted in the faith that Shemitah teaches us in our practical lives. We can ascend to ever higher levels. Thank you for being with us for part 1.